I'm now going to introduce you to our chair for tonight, the wonderful Dick Simon. Dick and I met 2 years ago at the World Economic Forum. And Dick, I hope that you will say something about the work that you're involved with. Dick is a mover of mountains and someone who likes to put people together, I think, to learn and to collaborate. Dick, I pass over to you for tonight.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and thank you for the incredibly important work that you do. Yes, it's been phenomenal getting to know you, and a huge benefit for me of working in this space with some of the incredible people who are involved, several of whom are on this panel right now. So I also want to just thank the panelists for the incredibly important work that they are doing, that we are all going to be learning about. My own background is, I was involved with business, a number of different business activities, and about 5 years ago became aware of the potential of these therapies to help people suffering from PTSD and other mental health issues. And initially, I personally was very skeptical. I mean, I grew up in a world where you just say no to these dangerous substances, and my brain had been very kind to me over the years. But I both read the data and unfortunately know about PTSD more than I wish I did from our family, where one of our daughter is suffers from PTSD as a result of an assault. So I knew that what we were doing, regardless of intent, regardless of resources, regardless of everyone's best efforts, doesn't always work, and we need a lot better tools. So about 5 years ago, I decided to devote all of my efforts to helping to advance this work. And that's kind of, my background. What has been absolutely astounding is over that brief period of 5 years, how much incredible progress has been made. A lot remains to be made, and you'll be hearing more about that this evening, but a lot has been made. And there's tremendous reason for optimism and hope, and tremendous need for ongoing support and development. So we have three wonderful panelists this evening. You've seen their bios, so I'll just very brief headlines, and then we'll turn over to each one of them to spend a few minutes just explaining a little bit about their work and perspective, and then we'll go to questions. So first is Dr. James Rucker, who is at King's College in the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, and is engaged in a trial utilizing these substances, working with Gilly and your organization, and we'll be sharing his. All these people are incredibly credentialed, but you don't want to hear me talk about it. You want to hear from them. Then we have Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who's director of the Center for the Study of Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma and then is at the VA, Veterans Administration in the United States, working again in behavioral health in the area of New York City, the Bronx, where she runs a large group there, and at Mount Sinai Hospital, where she is chairing and has created a center for studying psychedelics there. So Rachel has been incredibly instrumental in bringing this work forward in the US Veterans Administration and just generally in the United States and elsewhere. And then we have Dr. Eric Vermetten from the Netherlands, who is also very, very storied and comes from the military side working with the health service at the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and is also leading trials for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, which is doing work in Europe, advancing MDMA or for the potential of PTSD. So you'll be hearing a lot more. Why don't we start with Dr. Rucker, if you would. What are you doing? And in a few minutes, what do you want to make sure people understand as background to the work that you're involved with?
Sure, I'll do my best. Many thanks for that kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me. As Dick said, I'm James Rucker. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work at King's College London and the Maudsley Hospital, which is next door to King's. I specialise in the psychiatric problems of adulthood, of which PTSD is but one, and I'm particularly interested in people who don't get better with established treatments. And I lead a research team at King's called the Psychedelic Trials Group. We undertake specialised clinical trials of novel cutting-edge mental health treatments, for example, psilocybin and more latterly MDMA therapy. And MDMA therapy is a novel cutting-edge treatment for PTSD, it seems. It seems to work by temporarily flooding the brain with the feel-good neurotransmitter serotonin. I have to apologise a little bit to Rachel and Eric for my slightly noddy description that's coming up, but I hope this helps you to understand a little bit about how this drug may be helping. MDMA, as I say, it sort of floods the brain with serotonin, and this quietens down the fear system in the brain that seems to be so overactive in PTSD, and it induces a more general state of relaxation. And it's that general state of relaxation that, coupled with the support of a therapist, allows patients with PTSD to start to re-experience their symptoms without being overwhelmed. And I think that point's critical because this allows them to see, often for the first time, that they can engage in therapy. And this sows a seed that ongoing psychotherapy can nurture into post-traumatic growth. So Supporting Wounded Veterans as a charity have asked us to carry out the MDMA for PTSD trials here in the UK, which, along with Professor Alan Young, who is Chair of Mood Disorders at King's College London, we are genuinely delighted to do. We need to do the trials here because whilst convincing clinical trials have been undertaken by MAPS in the US, national medicines regulators in the UK and Europe have required that these US trials are replicated here in order for the treatment to receive a license in Europe. This is normal process, and this license is exactly the same process that approved the COVID-19 vaccine for use in the UK. It comes with the authority and the recognition that creates both medical and public confidence in a new treatment and allows it to be used in the general population. If we don't do these trials here in the UK, I think it will likely create considerable delay in UK veterans being given access to this treatment, if they're given access at all. So important that we do this work here. So we, in these trials, we propose to recruit participants with severe PTSD to take part and give them MDMA therapy in a safe and supportive environment at King's College Hospital. Clinical trials are complicated to set up, but Supporting Wounded Veterans really have been wonderful companions along the journey, and thanks to their tireless devotion to the cause, they've managed to engage a proportion of funding for these trials here in the UK from NHS England via the Armed Forces Health Commissioning Group. I think that's fantastic news because it helps us to get started with these trials. However, to complete them, we do need more funding, and SWV, collaborating with MAPS, have committed to raising this funding. And I just want to extend my heartfelt thanks to everyone who's been involved with the, frankly, colossal effort thus far to get through the clinical trial bureaucracy and all of the licensing requirements we need to go through in order to do these trials here. They really are non-trivial processes. I think it's really marvellous that Supporting Wounded Veterans, MAPS, NHS England and King's College London have come together to drive this cutting edge research forward. It really symbolises for me how attitudes towards these devastating mental illnesses like PTSD have changed. And I think in a post-COVID world where we will all be licking our collective wounds, this seems all the more timely. I want to step back in time briefly just to explore the history of MDMA. Many think of it as a party drug, but it's not. It was actually invented over a century ago by a pharmaceutical company called Merck. And it was actually used throughout the 20th century as a treatment, much as we are proposing to use it now. But during the 60s and 70s, similar to the psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and LSD, which were also used as medical treatment, it was swept up in the political war on drugs. And it was legally denoted as a dangerous drug that had no medical use. That legal definition is incorrect. MDMA is not as dangerous as many of the other medicines routinely prescribed in GP surgeries all over the UK and all over the world every day. Really, there was little reason to ban medical use then, and the same is true now. And yet 50 years after the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act in the UK and related laws in the US and other countries that enshrined these restrictions, we have to work under how veterans are living with the consequences of that political sleight of hand. It's a tragic irony, really, that they fought to uphold a system that has prevented their access to a treatment for their mental battle scars. And I hope we can do something with these trials to right that historical wrong. But away from the politics, the evidence from the US shows that MDMA therapy for PTSD is much better than existing treatments, and that is the point. There are few good treatments for PTSD, and this is even more true for veterans with PTSD. Yet 2/3 of people with severe PTSD who receive MDMA therapy get better. That, in my book, is a breakthrough, because for most other medical therapies, the rate of recovery is less than half of that, and quite often quite a lot less than half of that. So to bring MDMA therapy here to the UK, we should perform clinical trials here in the UK. This will persuade regulators here more effectively than if they have to rely on trials done in other countries. I think more importantly, it will challenge established stigmas surrounding MDMA, and it will persuade the wider medical profession that MDMA therapy for PTSD is a significant step forward that we should adopt at a national level. And if it works, then by golly, we should adopt it. Our veterans would expect nothing less, and given what we expect of them, they are right to. So I'll wrap up now. I've been talking for a few minutes. Just in summary, MDMA therapy is a treatment for severe PTSD, and here there are few treatments available and huge amounts of suffering. We need to show that MDMA therapy works here in the UK by undertaking clinical trials here. We can do this at King's, and my team is delighted to have joined with Supporting Wounded Veterans, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and NHS England to deliver these trials. With this trial evidence, regulators should be satisfied of the safety and effectiveness of MDMA therapy for PTSD to give us a license here. And with that license, a whole new opportunity for treatment will open up to those who suffer and die needlessly every day with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. So I hope that's made my position clear, and I hope you understand why I feel that these trials are of really critical importance to our patients here in the UK, but also more widely. And I'll stop there. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Dr. Rachel Yehuda, Rachel, if you can speak a bit on your interest in the work in the field of psychedelic medicine and how you came to be involved in this. You are muted.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And Dr. Rucker provided a very comprehensive explanation of MDMA and why the trials are being done in the UK. Similarly, I have been working with, I would like to say, 4 veterans for over 3 decades, and have been very devoted to the cause of trying to understand PTSD for the purpose of really learning how to eradicate it. I mean, this idea that the effects of the trauma persist and are transformative is really not what we're all taught about stress theory, that, you know, give it time and the wounds will heal. But somehow some wounds are very, very tenacious and long lasting. And I too saw the results from the initial trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and was very excited to see if it worked in veterans. But it's important to do the research because, as we all know, a lot of the clinical trials that have shown pretty good results for PTSD with other therapeutic modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy or use of antidepressants, they seem to work better in civilians than they work for combat veterans. And they seem to work even worse for combat veterans who have war-related disabilities. And many combat veterans not only have PTSD, but they also suffer from the effects of physical injuries, sometimes with traumatic brain injuries, and many other kinds of complicated problems as a result of their experiences. And so I think it's really important that we take this very promising therapy and see what it's like for combat veterans with PTSD. I like to say that combat trauma is a little different than civilian trauma. Many veterans have told me that even knowing what they know now, and even with all the PTSD they have, they wouldn't change their life. They would go back and do it again, which is not really something that you often hear from rape victims, for example, or concentration camp survivors. And it's something that's kind of like the best of times and the worst of times. So if you have an experience that is so defining, it's not just that a trauma happened and you're transformed, it's that a transformational experience happened and you're trying to really grapple with it, and how can we do it? Now, Dr. Rucker talked about perhaps MDMA reducing fear. I think that it isn't as much that, although certainly one aspect, but it's also this ability of truly feeling safe enough to open up. Many combat veterans have gone to therapy for a long time. And you know what? You sit in the room and you talk for 50 minutes and you do it again the next week, but you withhold a piece of what's really bothering you because you don't want to go there and you don't want to bring it up. And the opportunity provided by psychedelic psychotherapy is to be able to go there and to be able to open up in a very safe, supportive way, feeling empathy and self-compassion as opposed to the usual shame and blame that combat veterans usually experience, particularly when they're about to talk about a trauma. So the catch-22 of treating combat PTSD has been that one of the hallmark symptoms of PTSD is avoidance. You don't want to think about or talk about or be reminded of the trauma. And that's kind of not compatible with treatment where you have to talk about the trauma. So here perhaps is a workaround where you can take a medicine that puts you in a state that is conducive to being able to do the work that has to be done. And so I'm very excited to bring it to veterans and to try it out and see how it works. And that's why we started the Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma at Mount Sinai.
Great, well, thank you. And again, thank you for the incredible work you're doing for veterans and have been for decades. Next, we will hear from Professor Eric Vermetten, who, again, can you share what brought you to this and what do you see as promises and challenges?
Well, thank you, Dick, and I speak also to James and Rachel. Lovely introductions and the science, and it's really important. You know, I've been in this field in the military, as a military psychiatrist for 20 years, and what brought me here is actually something that actually started way back before. You know, what brought me here is what I learned from a colleague here that passed away years ago, Jan Bastiaans, who was a professor at Leiden University, that was pioneering at what at that time was called concentration camp syndrome. And Rachel referred to that briefly already. Is after the Second World War, there were people who survived the concentration camps, and there was no knowledge about PTSD at that time. We called it concentration camp syndrome. Same symptoms as we see now typically in PTSD. And what he did, he was ahead of his time, and he used LSD for the treatment of concentration camp syndrome. And you know, these people were freed. Some of the people were freed, but they weren't free in their minds. Every conversation was redirected towards the time that they spent in the concentration camp, and their lives were narrowed down. Their emotional regulation was a mess. They couldn't sleep every time there was their nightmares. And what he felt that was LSD was exactly the same words as Rachel just said. It helped them to open up. It helped them to disclose what was so difficult for them to disclose. So your question, Dick, is what helped me to, or what motivated me to this trajectory. Actually, it incentivized me when I read a paper by John Crystal. John Crystal is the head of psychiatry at Yale University. I spent some time at Yale University in the past, and that's where I know Rachel from. And he wrote an editorial in Biological Psychiatry, and the title of that was, "It is time to address the crisis in the pharmacotherapy of PTSD." It is time to address the crisis in the pharmacotherapy of PTSD. I'm reading this twice because what the hell, why is he talking about? Well, actually, we have a disorder here that's called PTSD. We see it in the world, not only in the military, civilian as well, very prevalent, and we only have 2 medications, sertraline and paroxetine, that's all, and the rest we're doing off-label. So he said, why don't we have more opportunities? So we need to think out of the box. There's not that many compounds that pharmaceutical industry has to offer for us. So we need to look at old medications, the ones that we put down, the ones that we made illegal at the time of the war on drugs. They have really promises. MDMA is in that way, it's a very gentle psychedelic. It's actually, if you look at it, it's not really a psychedelic. It's a psycholytic drug. It opens you up. Again, I want to emphasize that word. So it opens you up to re-experience events that otherwise be very, very difficult to tolerate. Let me give you one example. When I first saw the patient in a video of a training demonstration, and this was I think it was an Iraq veteran, a Marine. And typically when we do this work in re-exposing them to their horrific memories, what we see is a reliving experience when you invite the veteran, re-expose yourself. So tell me the story again. Typically, that's tough work. That's tough work. See blood pressure go up, we see emotional dysregulation go up. They don't want to go there. So when you invite them to the therapy room, go back there. And when I looked at the video where this guy had MDMA, quote unquote, on board, he relived an experience that served as an index trauma for him. Now, what was the experience? He was in a Bushmaster and he got a lot of incoming fire. And he needed to take shelter. So he jumped off. He was a board gunner. And so jumped off the Bushmaster, but he witnessed that his buddy burned to life in a Bushmaster. Now, typically when we relive that experience, there's a high SUT score. We call that subjective units of distress. You don't want to go there. When he was reliving that experience with MDMA, he was sort of almost at peace. And he could address the guilt that he never could disclose before. He could address the guilt and the shame. Did I do enough to save my buddy? Well, I had to take revenge, take shelter myself. So that's a long story to sort of, from Jan Bastiaans to the fact that we don't have good medications, to that anecdote that it opens up your experience, and to really work through experience that by just talking therapy or by cognitive behavioral therapy, you don't get there. You don't get there. As an introduction, Dick.
That's great. Thank all of you for sort of helping set the stage. So a few, initially like a practical question here. Are the clinical trials limited to veterans? And if so, will this change in the future? And this is to any of the panelists who I can direct, but you know, whoever would like to address this.
Different people are studying different populations. The sponsor, MAPS, opened it up to anyone, any kind of trauma. Our first study that we're going to be concentrating on is exclusively for combat veterans.
Yeah, the study that we're doing, we're starting an open label study and doing a phase 3 study in Leiden at the Center 45 in Oostgeest is not only in veterans, but it's in uniformed professionals, but also in civilians. So try to emphasize on uniformed professionals, but extending it open. And there's other trials that are happening in Europe, and they're not focused on veterans only. So since I come from military, and same for Rachel, we try to emphasize its military relevance, But of course, it's not only limited to that population.
Yeah, it's similar for us, really. We're concentrating on the diagnosis. It happens to be that diagnosis tends to cluster in veterans. So veterans are a part of our work, but the diagnosis is the focus.
Got it. What are you all seeing in terms of public and political support? I mean, these are historically very stigmatized, and yet the scientific evidence to this point is extremely exciting and positive. How's that support and/or opposition manifesting, and how do you intend to build the positive support?
What was so interesting when Gilly Norton, and she does a great job at what she's doing for supporting wounded veterans. When she showed me the endorsement, the public endorsement of Nick Carter, your British CDS, that was wonderful. How about a public endorsement? If your highest military officer endorses MDMA as psychotherapy. Now, I haven't seen it in the Netherlands yet, so I think that is really a very bold statement, a very, very powerful statement. But indeed, as you say, yes, this has been sort of in a way criminalized, and this is by the recreational arm has a name to this. The way I try to brand it is I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a clinical psychiatrist, and we need to portray this as a drug, a medicine, patient's drug as a medicine. So I'd like to give medicines to my patients. So the rebranding of this is MDMA as a medicine for the treatment of a disorder or an injury, if you would call it that way.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts about that. I mean, I think we need to reframe the whole narrative around drugs, that they are tools. Just like a tool in your toolbox, you have to learn what it's used for, what it's good for, what it's not good for. It's the same with drugs. We should be scientific and objective about them and not resort to rhetoric. And that is where we have been with drugs like MDMA for a long time. Yet if you look back to history, you see that they do historically have signs of a medical use. And I think that to challenge established stigmas, most people would find it difficult to argue against evidence established through internationally agreed process of clinical trials that showed MDMA was an effective therapy for PTSD. Few would be able to argue against a reframing of the narrative and social and political attitude towards MDMA with that sort of evidence, and that would serve as a sort of exemplar, if you like, for how science can reframe what has been historically, for all of my life, actually, arguments based on rhetoric and hearsay.
Yeah, so shifting rhetoric and hearsay to facts and data and truth and what will help people. That seems like a pretty good aspiration, a great idea. Can you explain to people sort of how this treatment works? I mean, many people calling in, this is their first exposure to what we're talking about here. So can someone, whoever would like to.
Rachel.
Yeah. How does this work? You take a pill, what happens?
Well, the deep answer to that question is we don't know exactly how it works, but what we do know is that there's something about the opportunity of being in an altered state of consciousness that is very, very profound. And Stanislav Grof said it best when he said that psychedelics are to psychiatry what the telescope is to astronomy and the microscope is to biology. When you are in an altered state with a psychedelic, you can see something that perhaps you can't see when you're just in your normal state. And that thing that you see can make all the difference in the world in how you then understand what happened to you and what you can do next. You don't have to keep taking the psychedelic once you've seen the insight that you need to see. So I think that there are a lot of studies being done now. Dr. Rucker mentioned releasing serotonin as well as dopamine, as well as other sympathetic nervous system compounds, as well as hormones. Oxytocin is released, prolactin, cortisol is released. But then you think to yourself, wait a minute, these are also stress hormones. What's going on? We don't know. It's a very drastic thing that happens for 7 hours, but the effects are very, very short-lived. So one of the things that I particularly like about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is that you're in a state for a relatively short period of time. And then the work that happens after is thinking all about what happened and what it means. We're going to have to come up with a science that is going to help us understand what happens, whether it is that we develop systems of synaptic plasticity, we develop mechanisms of resilience or neural network pathways associated with healing, not just reversing something that perhaps is altered as a result of trauma and PTSD, but really building something positive on it. And, you know, PTSD itself was a mystery when it first burst on the scene, because most people thought about stress as something that you can get over, especially when the stressor is removed, when the stressor is in the past. And people talk a lot about fight or flight. And everybody knows that the fight or flight response is an acute response that happens at the time of an event, but may not necessarily explain why the effects of the event are prolonged, lasting years and decades, which is the case in PTSD. And it took us several decades to understand that the fight or flight response that brought about the PTSD isn't really the biology that is sustaining the PTSD, but rather there are epigenetic mechanisms that really allow the trauma effects to live on as they do. I think we're going to learn the same thing about psychedelics, that it's not just what happens during those 7 hours when you're under the influence of the medicine, but that process that allows change to occur, allows the healing effects of psychedelics to endure. So I'm very excited to be able to think about these things and study them. And if we do, then what will happen is we will change the entire way that we deal with mental health, particularly when it comes to trauma-related disorders. We're going to have completely new paradigms for understanding where we want to go and why.
Thank you. Question here, can someone expand on, we've heard the term psychedelic and the psycholytic. What are psychedelics? What is included? What isn't included? How might they be different? And, you know, what's different about MDMA? Psychedelics.
Oh, well, we could have a whole week on psychedelics, and students particularly nowadays are very interested in psychedelics because, as Rachel said, it opens up a new approach to understanding yourself, your identity, who Dick Simon is, who Eric Vermetten is. Sort of it unravels your identity, yourself, your soul. And you know, the difference between psychedelic and psycholytic, you just named two. Psychedelic is when you re-experience the world in a different way. Like I see your nose as longer, or your hair, but also I see the organic nature. I see that trees really live, and I can't see that without. So that's the real psychedelic arm of it. And I can see then they were all part of nature and all part of a bigger cosmos. So that has probably meaning to that you contribute that experience. Psycholytic is different since it opens up the experience to yourself, your own being. And then when I talked about guilt and shame, these are things that can sort of be in your way. And the psycholytic experience doesn't make you see noses or hair different colors. I see the same Dick Simon, I see the same Rachel Yehuda, but I relive the experience as more gentle towards myself. And I'm not bothered by the guilt that it's really in my way to disclose things. So psycholytic is like MDMA, it's much more gentle. It's not, you don't have to be afraid of MDMA because it's not gonna alter your way of reliving the world. It opens up the world in a different way that access your emotional material in a novel way. So yeah, you see me how I talk about this. I'm very, very passionate about it because we typically struggle with addressing these things in therapy. But here, there's this drug, you have one pill and you just have to do nothing. You don't even have to tell the patient or the client, you need to go this or that or whatever. No, they know themselves where to go. You just wait and observe, but you need to be there because it's a very fragile state. You can't walk away and go to the bathroom without telling. No, you have to be there for that 7 hours. And that's a novel concept. It's not like, hey, 45 minutes and your session is over. No, no, no. This is something that's really different. It's 7 hours. It's not trivial. So just to answer briefly then, what Rachel said, typically it is 12 sessions. Preparatory sessions where you do a motivational assessment, 3 preparatory sessions, 1 MDMA session. The preparatory sessions are an hour and a half. And then the MDMA session typically is a day long. Then you have what we call reintegrative sessions, where you think back of what changes. So I address this guilt. Am I now going a different spouse to my wife? I'm going to address the anger that I had typically to my wife. I'm reliving that. I'm trying to make more meaning of that. But I see myself as a softer being. So 3 sessions, then you have a second MDMA session, and then you have 3 reintegration sessions. So you have 12 sessions over a period of about 3 months. That's typically the paradigm that we currently have for the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. But you hear me say, it's not just taking a pill and that's it. Now, it's the assisted psychotherapy arm, and we typically tend to forget it's about psychedelics. No, it's about psychotherapy that is catalyzed by a pill.
Great. Thank you. Is there likely to be greater stigma and reluctance for veterans to use MDMA and potentially other psychedelics, given the military's zero tolerance attitude to recreational drugs? And secondly, can anyone speak to the potential risk of addictions or harm?
James?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer the first question, but as to the second, the potential for addictions, very, very limited evidence. In fact, I mean, the best evidence for the classical psychedelics, LSD, was in alcoholism. So it seemed to have an anti-addictive property. MDMA, I think, has some reinforcing properties, but certainly nothing like some of the drugs that we use as painkillers, the opiates, for example. So relatively speaking, whilst there's some addiction potential for MDMA, it's not great relative to other drugs that are less legally restricted. For psychedelics, there is no evidence that they are addictive.
Well, if you may, like we have different psychedelics, and if you can call ketamine a psychedelic, some people argue it has maybe dissociative characteristics, not psychedelic. So ketamine is more addictive than MDMA. MDMA, really, I agree with James, is not really addictive, nor has it. In the past, people were having ideas that it would make the prefrontal cortical brain cells die earlier, but that's sort of a kind of a fake history. There's within the realm, of course, if you drink too much, it's going to be toxic. If you do everything too much, is dangerous. But in that bandwidth of what we typically use is about 60, maybe more, 80 to 100, 140, 160, 180 milligrams. That you get a little bit of a blood pressure, so you have to be careful with cardiovascular risk. But then there's a lot of safety data now that have been reported to the FDA, and the EMA will get that same data. Is that it is a very safe compound.
Yeah, I want to address the first part of your question, which is, are people going to be afraid or reluctant to try this? Are veterans specifically going to be afraid? And the answer to that is that it is quite possible that there will be a reluctance. I don't think it's because of the illegal status or because of the military stance on these medicines, but I think that the idea of losing control of your narrative, the idea that you might go visit something that is scary or unpleasant that you've worked really, really hard to bury, it could be very, very challenging. We all put some stuff in the basement and in the attic because nobody ever goes there. And there might really be a fear that the medicine will take you somewhere against your will. And I think it's a very important part of the education of using psychedelics to say that that doesn't actually happen, not in that way. I think that if anything, the medicine gives one a curiosity about what might be in the attic or in the basement, or maybe a reluctance to open, or maybe this idea that it would be okay to open the door, but it's also okay to slam it back if you're not ready. And sometimes it will take more than 1 or 2 or 3 treatments to fully open the door and embrace it. But it's the idea of knowing that you can do that. I think also sometimes there's maybe a lack of trust about the therapists that you're with. They might be different than the ones you've been working with for a long time. You might think that they don't understand you. They might not be like you. They may not look like you. They may not have had your experiences. And all of these are very real fears and concerns. And on the other hand, that's weighed against this opportunity to really do something transformative. And what I would say about this to all people who are thinking about this is that those fears are perfectly normal. And the reason that we have the preparatory sessions built in to the therapy is to discuss those things and to put them out there and bring them on the table. And hopefully those very legitimate concerns, in that it is legitimate to have concerns about something that you've never experienced, can be addressed, and people can start from a safe place. But this isn't truth serum. You don't have things that just come tumbling out of you without your control. It's a very different process than that. It's a process where you begin to see that the thing that you're most afraid of confronting isn't as scary as you thought it was, and may be able to be available for some kind of an exploration. And that can be very, very healing.
So what you're describing there is, once someone has had a psychedelic experience or an MDMA experience, or even once you are working with them in the preparatory sessions, has the stigma been a barrier in terms of recruitment for the trials, which are still small numbers, relative to huge populations? Or once information is out there, are veterans and others sufficiently motivated that, all right, nothing else has worked, I'll try this?
Dick, I think the stigma may not so much be MDMA, but I hear this conversation more and more, especially in the veterans population. They're on disability, right? So, and they hear all this popular hype like, oh, a cure is great. What if I get better? Will I lose my disability? Or what? These are questions, are very legitimate questions. And we just don't know. We need to figure out what the effect is in these veteran population. And that's more of a concern, I think, than the MDMA arm itself.
Well, if I can just piggyback on that, I think it's not so much a fear of losing the disability. It might be a fear that the gains are permanent, because a lot of people have had experiences where they have gotten a little bit better, or they've gotten a lot better, and then something happens and boom, it comes back again. And so it's not unusual for people, even people who have had really severe and disabling PTSD at some time in their lives, to have really good periods. But there is a lack of trust sometimes that those good periods will be sustained. What I think is different about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy potentially is that it's not about dulling symptoms, it's not about suppressing feelings, it's not about, habituating to one narrative. It's really about looking at yourself and your experiences very differently, and you don't turn back from that. But I think that the concern of how long will it stick and whether this will be a permanent fix is legitimate, and it's something that we're going to learn more over time, as we follow people over time. So there's no justification for removing anyone's disability, because we just don't have any experience to know what's coming down the road. And I think that you know, I hope that that would never be a barrier
Right.
Great.
for somebody to try to heal.
Thank you. Can someone speak to the results so far? I mean, you know, we've made reference to great results and like just helping the audience kind of understand what that really means and how that compares to other treatments.
Oh, well, okay. James, don't want to take it away from you.
No, please, Eric.
No, well, the results thus far is this goes back when I was first exposed to the results from the 2011 study, which was a small study that showed a placebo arm and an MDMA arm. And the placebo results were what we typically would say a drop on the CAP score, which would be less symptoms of PTSD. But when I was shown the results of the MDMA assisted psychotherapy, these results were through the baseline. Through the baseline, I mean, at the end of the therapy, these participants did no longer meet criteria for PTSD. So they were cured. Now, that's not often that we say that in psychiatry. They were cured. They didn't have symptoms of PTSD anymore. And moreover, if you follow them up 3 years down the line, they didn't relapse. So they were sustained. So this has been now replicated in six randomized trials, and the data of those 6 randomized trials have been pooled, and they served as the data that now have been submitted to the FDA, and they got breakthrough therapy assignment, and actually we'll see more results coming out shortly that will give us more insight as to the exact effect sizes, but they're pretty strong. That's for sure.
Yeah, cure is a word I'm not ready to use yet. I think that
well, if you don't meet symptoms, then you're cured. But
I'm not ready for cure, but I'm ready to be very enthusiastic about how profound the changes with just one course of MDMA assisted psychotherapy, which you correctly explained takes about 3 months to go through. Time will tell. I think that I'm very, very hopeful, but I think part of it is that I'm wondering what you're cured from. I mean, you've had an experience, and the experience has stayed with you because it's so distressing that you can't stop thinking about it. You become distressed at reminders of it. You try to distance yourself from reminders, but your body is very hypervigilant because even if you tell yourself not to think about it in the body, there's a sense that there's still danger or there could be again. So I don't know if you get cured from that so much as that you develop another way to be in the world where you have more control over the environment. You feel like you can induce a sense of safety and mastery, and that you can make meaning out of all the things that happen to you, and that it isn't sort of you're following the lead of these reactions, but rather you're more conducting the orchestra of your body by being able to interpret signals in a different way and kind of live with them. So I think it's more being in balance with yourself and in the world, not feeling this idea that you have to go isolate because you might hurt someone, for example, feeling that you're going to have control over that and that you have a right to be part of the world, that you are part of the world, in fact, and that the world, you belong in the world and the world embraces you, which is really not a feeling that a lot of people with PTSD walk around with. I just think that it's a dramatic change in perspective toward in a very
the world with their service dog or with their spouses, but they're connecting again. And I feel that the connecting itself, as if it's neural reintegration or making new synapses, it's sort of making connections again, meaningful connection. That's a reinforcer then that sort of reinforces the behavioral aspects as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I suppose, the headline figure is that 2/3 of people get better with this treatment, and they stay better. And that's very, very notable. It is not just the drug, it's the therapy that goes along with it, and it's the message, and it's the reorientation, and it's giving the patient a toolbox, if you like, to take away with them, to think about their narrative and trauma, which is not going to, we don't want to eradicate. It's part of their history, that's part of you, that's okay. That's the point, but it's how you relate to that that's important. But there's something special about this therapy that seems to help people come to that understanding. And I think that's the point, because when I write a prescription for sertraline, I can only be sure that about 1 in 10 of the people that prescription are going to get better. And many of the other people who get that prescription won't get better, and they'll get side effects. So that's very unsatisfactory from my perspective. So this treatment is, this is a breakthrough in my book.
I just want to underscore, just to make sure everybody heard that clearly. So in the case, with MDMA assisted psychotherapy, or psychotherapy assisted by MDMA, 2/3 of the people are getting better versus 1 in 10 getting better with adverse side effects in many of the 90% that are not getting better. I mean, that's astounding.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to contextualize it a bit. If I hand out a prescription for sertraline, it doesn't come with a load of psychotherapy. So, it's there's pros and cons. But yeah, I mean, essentially the SSRIs are not working well. I mean, that's part of the reason why so few of them are licensed. It's very difficult to find a signal there. This treatment seems to work a lot better.
So we're unfortunately, running toward the end of our time here. I have one more question. Why does every country, and this is more of a geopolitical or a regulatory question, but it helps set the framework for why we're all here this evening. Why does every country have to do their own independent trials? And what happens if we don't do trials in the UK? Would there still be access to treatment when it's approved in the Netherlands and America? Or wherever.
Let me very briefly, I want to give the word to Rachel as well. We need to do these trials. The FDA has is almost there. We wanted to have registration in 2023 in the US, maybe targeting 24 in Europe. Now, this is important for the EU as well. Every country has its own regulation and of these making the drug accessible in their respective countries. So we need to do the phase 3 trials to bring these data to the EMA, European Medical Agency, to get the registration. And then every country can decide how they wanted to implement it into their mental health care system. Now, the UK, and as Gilly said in the beginning, should not lag behind. This is important for the UK with all the charities.
Reassured by trials that are done locally. So whilst we don't have to in order to get a license, I think we're more likely to if we do that. I think you also got to think about the process of making the therapy available in a country. If it gets a license, but you haven't done the clinical trials, then you're sort of playing catch up. Whereas if you've done the trials, then you've established the therapy centers, you've trained the therapists, you've got the doctors who are experienced in the trial, and that sows a seed. So you get a head start in delivering the treatment. So from many perspectives, it's good for us to be a part of this research here in the UK.
I think we've come to the end pretty much.
Oh, gosh.
I'm so sorry. It's such a huge subject and it's such a fascinating one. And I would like to thank you all so much for coming tonight. You've given us an amazing talk, and the chat is full of, can we please have some more? Can we please do this again? Can we please have some more information? There are just a couple of things that I wanted to say. A lot of you have asked about how do we stop this being stigmatized, or how do we make this more mainstream? And I think the answer is that we do trials. We do lots of research. And I think we've been very lucky here that the NHS have come in with us. I think that will make it much more mainstream. And I think wonderful that our patron, General Sir Nick Carter, has stood up and said that he wants to see the trials here and that we shouldn't get left behind, as Eric puts it. So I'd like to thank you all. Dick, thank you for chairing it so well. Eric, Rachel, James, it was a huge pleasure to have you. It really was.
Thank you.
We will look forward to seeing you all next week when General Sir Nick Carter, our patron, will be speaking about the global strategic context and a return to great power competition. There is a lot of information on the website. This talk will be available on the website for a limited amount of time. So if you want to listen to it again or the bits that you missed, you can go and watch it then. And in the meantime, I wish you all a very good night, and to our wonderful panelists, again, huge thank you. Good night, everybody.
So,
Bye.
Bye-bye. Cheers.